Morning, guys. Hello from Minnesota, where it finally was warmed up now. It was only 13 below this morning. When I was in the Navy on a ship during the Vietnam War, and we had 13 officers on my ship, and every morning we'd, all the officers except the captain, he always had his breakfast in his cabin, but the rest of us all ate together, had breakfast together and other meals in a special room on the ship or cabin or whatever. And we always had TV going. And whenever they showed the map of the United States in the wintertime on that, when it was cold, it seemed like the purple area, that was always where it was really cold, always was up there on Minnesota. And 12 guys would shake their heads and look at that, and they'd look at me and said, how in the world could anybody ever want to live in a place like Minnesota where it's cold like that? Well, this morning it was 13 below here in Minneapolis, and 35 below this morning up where my deer are living in my study area up by the Canadian border. And we've had 11 days of this. And when it's this cold, the whitetails up there particularly, where it's really cold, don't eat on days like this. They'll just stay in their beds all day and live on fat stores. In the fall they eat like crazy. They load up on stored fat in their bodies. They get all this fat over their hindquarters, well, everywhere in their bodies. And they can live on that without feeding during the wintertime. And I'm guessing a little bit, but it's pretty close, I think. They store enough fat to live without eating for at least 30 days during the winter. And gee, you get 11 days like that, one little stretch here. Those deer haven't been feeding out there when 30, it got down to close to 40 below up there one time. But they're not feeding when that's going on. They don't want to waste, they'll just stay right in their beds. And so they're living on fat stores. Now, we've had colder weather earlier this winter as well, but I haven't kept track of it like I usually do because of being under the weather for a long period. But anyway, I would say they've used up about 2/3 of their fat stores by this time. So what that means is that they've got about 10 days left of fat stores. So from this point on, now we're supposed to warm up this coming week. We're going to be up in the low 30s this coming week and get a little bit of a thaw. So now we've got to hope that we don't get a lot of really frigid weather again the rest of the winter, because if they do, we're going to have some starving deer. Once they use up that last 10%, then they're in trouble. So now we've got to hope for milder weather the rest of the way, so they'll be able to get out and feed regularly. Well, back to the subject at hand. This is the third part of a series I've been doing. You can't do it all in one hour of learning how to find stand sites for antlered bucks while breeding is in progress. We do it to find non-breeding bucks while breeding is in progress, and non-breeding bucks can be rather large bucks, and actually they represent up to 60% of all the bucks living in the area where you hunt. Before this happens in September and the first half of October, all those bucks are living in, each square mile has quite a few bucks living in, 3 to 5 mature bucks, and then plus some yearling bucks living in every square mile. And 60% of them are gone when breeding begins because the dominant breeding buck chased them all out of there. And plus, it chases out the yearling bucks, and we talked a lot about that last time. They keep coming back, and so they're a problem for the dominant breeding buck. But where they go, they find refuge in small areas off range. Most of them, some of them are in range too. If there's a place that the dominant breeding buck doesn't regularly visit, away from the scrape and antler rub trails. But most of them are off range. And because they're off range, they're also out of the area that you usually hunt. You don't hunt in those areas. You don't find reason to do it. There's plenty of deer where you hunt, plenty of trails, all the things you're looking for. So there's areas you kind of ignore. And most of those areas you just wouldn't want to go there anyway. They're too tough, and we'll be talking about that here in a few minutes. But anyway, like this year, you know, we talked about that too. The number of deer in our hunting area have been reduced to 3 to 4 per square mile because of excessive number of wolves for a long, long time. And northern Wisconsin's having the same problem. I get letters all the time from guys up there, and they're having exactly the same problem, because as our wolves in the Arrowhead part of Minnesota, northeastern Minnesota, began increasing, young wolves there didn't have a place to start home ranges of their own. And they couldn't just walk into a neighboring home range and expect to be able to hunt for food there. If they're caught by the resident wolves, the wolves that normally live there, those resident wolves will kill that wolf that snuck into their range to hunt. It's kind of a dangerous thing. So anyway, the young wolves have to hunt far and wide, looking for areas that aren't inhabited by other wolves. And in doing so, they've spread to the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, at least the eastern parts, into the northern part of Iowa, even south of Minnesota, and into Wisconsin, neighboring Wisconsin to the east, and upper Michigan. And those guys in upper half of Wisconsin and upper Michigan are having the same problems we've been having up in the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. So things I'm talking about, you know, having few deer and being interested, more interested in finding these hideaways that all these other antler bucks live in temporarily for at least 2 weeks, off range after the dominant breeding bucks have run them off range. Like last year, gee, you know, where we were, you could walk straight north from our camp and you could walk 2 miles and never find a track in the snow. I've never seen anything like that in all the years we've been there, 31 years. Never been like that. It was so few deer. But at the same time, I started thinking, you know, I wonder how those non-breeding bucks are doing. You know, and they're anywhere from 2.5 to 6.5 years age, same age as dominant breeding bucks, and a lot of them are trophy class deer, really nice bucks. And so I thought, you know, that 60% that aren't there during the time we're hunting, during our firearm hunting season in Minnesota. So I wonder how they fared. So I spent the last 2 days of our hunt this last year scouting for those kind of bucks. And I've spent a lot of time off range, areas I never hunted. It's outside of my study area, east and west and north. And well, even a little bit south. Anyway, so I wanted to go through those areas to see if I could locate more areas that where these older bucks go while breeding is in progress, and where they hide, these hideaways. Now, these hideaways can have dual purposes, as I've learned over the years. For example, you know, the thing about hideaways, they go there to avoid the dominant breeding because he's particularly dangerous. But a lot of them live in these small areas. They're smaller, like ½ acre maybe, that size. They aren't that big. They're small areas. A lot of these bucks live there while they're growing antlers from May all the way up to September 1st. And usually they're close to water, but really heavy cover. You won't hardly find a deer trail in the area. It's just thick cover. Places that, you know, wolves and bears and other deer and maybe moose and humans don't walk because there's no trails there. And so they're safe there. These areas are the safest place these bucks know in the whole country. And they generally are safe. And if they're off range and you're not familiar with them, you might have a really hard time finding them because most of them are off trail. You know, you could be walking along and say, well, there's no deer around here. And yet, one of those half-acre areas might start right over there. You can be really close and not realize it. Especially if that deer is not moving out of that spot all summer long. And like I say, unless they're going to water, and usually water isn't far away if it isn't right there in that half acre or right next to it. And there's food there, mostly grains, you know, grasses all summer long, they're eating grasses. And cover and storms, that kind of thing. So everything they want is there, those kind of things. And generally that means that you don't want to be there. Yeah, when you see, you're walking through the woods and you look over there, boy, it's all full of water. It's brushy, so brushy you can't hardly see. Which might be, you know, my wife and I spent part of our winters every year in Texas studying whitetails. And south central Texas, that's a huge area, hundreds of miles in all directions, is mostly brushland. And most of that brush is no more than 10 feet tall and smaller, and it's full of cactuses. Oh, there's prickly pears and every other kind of cactus you might imagine in there, and poisonous snakes, you know, rattlesnakes, and it's terrible. But it's one of the most famous and most popular areas to hunt for trophy bucks in that whole big state of Texas, that south central area. And President Johnson had a ranch in south central Texas, and he used to hunt those deer there. And a lot of guys, you know, rather than wandering around in those things making a lot of noise and crawling through that brush, sort of like our elder swamps, making a lot of noise, they decided to be stand hunters. And what got to be really big back in the 50s or 60s is they had these pods they made out of fiberglass, kind of like a you know, oblong thing up here, and then they put them up on big high legs again up there 15 feet above the ground. And I understand President Johnson even had the red phone there in case the Russians decided to invade, and we had to start a counterattack before the atomic bombs started dropping and things like that. But when you fly over that country, and we've flown over it quite a few times, and for different trips in different areas, but you look down there on those brushlands, and you would see that here's what looks like a big cross, or you know, out in the middle of the brushland and all that prickly pear cactus, like they bulldozed shooting lanes, and that's exactly what they were. And then at the cross, there would either be a shack on the ground with windows all around it, right in the middle, or one of these pods, you know. And that way they had 4 directions they could watch. If deer walked into any of those openings, they could shoot at them. And they kind of specialized in shooting them with long-range calibers, their rifles, really accurate scopes. But a lot of trophy-class bucks came from that back in the 50s and 60s. Good area to hunt. These brushlands were wonderful for taking deer. Well, my first study area in Minnesota was in the middle of an area that was more swamp and bog and brushlands, like elder swamps, than highland timber, the kind of stuff where most of us like to hunt. And we did most of our hunting on those highlands, and they're kind of limited, but we had swamps and bogs. To the north of us was a bog at least 20 miles long and maybe 15, 20 miles wide. Huge spruce bog with moss and water in the trails, and and it was just a miserable place to go across. But there were islands out there. In fact, there was one place, my brother and I called it Big Island. It was maybe 10 acres in size, 10, 11 acres, something like that out there. We called it big because most of the islands out there were small, maybe half acre, 1 acre, you know. You could stand at the edge of the spruce bog or somewhere in there where you could get a look. Some of the places were open, just muskeg, just that deep moss. And then a whole bunch of spruce trees would be over in the distance. But you could look out over these spruce bogs, and here and there you'd see really tall trees growing. And not big expanses of tall trees. And most of those trees were aspens. We call them popples here in Minnesota. They use them for making wood pulp or for making paper. But anyway, you spot a clump of them out there, and after we got used to knowing that deer would go out there and spend time out there, and some of them were bucks that just stayed out there year-round, and maybe some of those little bigger places, and that big island that we used to look at, you know, we knew where it was, and we would only go out there to hunt if hunting was really tough on the highland that we normally hunted. You know, if we weren't having much luck there, we'd say, well, I guess it's time to go to Big Island. And it was a mile hike across that bog, that spruce bog, to get to that island. We always got a buck there, you know, the two of us, we'd get one, and it would take us all day to get it back to where vehicles were parked or camp was located. And a lot of times it was 10, 11 o'clock at night before we got back. You know, it would be coming back to the flashlight, a lot of resting, and haul a big buck out of there. The last time I was going to use it, I'm getting off to the side here a little bit, but it's kind of interesting. We had a bad year, and the reason we were having a bad year that year is that the state had decided that the old logging trail that we used to get to where we hunted, which had mud holes in it, if you didn't know how to drive through mud holes or what to do if you got stuck in one, you just didn't go out there. And so we had that almost to ourselves. There were a few guys, old-timers, who had been coming in there for years, and we all had different areas we hunted, and we didn't bother each other. We all had our own separate area. And this Nordberg area was our area there. Well, anyway, when things got tough, we went out there. And, but that one year, the last year, we decided to give it a try. My son Ken and I were going to go out early in the morning. Tomorrow morning, we're going to go out to Big Island. And we started off in the dark. We always did that way. We wanted to get to Big Island before it got light in the morning. You had to go by compass. Could hardly see what was up ahead there unless it was moonlight. But anyway, we were about halfway across that big bog, and we could hear engines coming. And lo and behold, a little bit off to one side, on the right side, here comes some headlights on an ATV. And then another set. And honest to gosh, this is honest truth. There were 11 of them. Back then, there wasn't restrictions about where people could drive those ATVs. A lot of them even had a gizmo on the front called a brush cutter, and they could go through elders and stuff with that, knock them down and keep going. And that's the kind of thing they had. And you know, they drove 10 feet away from us. They went right by us. We were standing there with our mouths hanging open. They never stopped to say hello or wave or anything. They just went right by us, heading toward Big Island. How they knew where to go, I don't know. But maybe an aerial map or something like that. They decided, well, let's go out there and give that a try. So when that happened, well, we turned around, went back to camp. But that year we had ATVs all over the place. It was just like a bee's nest with buzzing of ATVs going on. They were playing games and doing spins around on that logging trail. And And it's just constant sound of those ATVs all day long. And that morning, opening morning, you know, in my study area there, I had 22 permanent tree stands in that study area. And that morning, that last morning, year on opening morning, every one of them was filled with somebody we never seen before. And it was legal, you know, it was public land, so they could use them if they wanted. But it was such a, we didn't get any deer that year. We went home so disgusted. And we said, well, it's time we find a new study area, and that's how we ended up by the Canadian border. Well, back to the subject. Now, next spot I want to talk about. Now, keep this in mind now. I've been talking about general areas, or half-acre areas, put it that way, about that we know, that I've come to know as places where these non-breeding bucks would go and spend their time, their 2 weeks, during the period that those were on heat, and the big buck was really vicious and chasing them away and that kind of thing. They'd go to these little spots, and we learned certain of those spots were really good places to go during that period if you needed to go hunt other bucks other than what was in the highlands where we hunted. Well, this here map here is kind of a simple thing. Here's some of that highland we normally hunted down here. This section below the green here is all mixed timber, and we've shot a lot of bucks in that area. One of my best bucks I took right here one time. One year, my son Dave, he had a spot right there, and he took 2 yearling bucks there. And the reason he took 2 yearling bucks here, there's this island over here in the swamp, and a doe lived there. It lived there. It wasn't big enough an area for her to live her whole life on this. It's about 11 acres area here. I estimated it out in this big elder swamp. And so she would come out here and feed out here. There was a big area here with this, all kinds of huge sugar maples, and there was lots of grass growing, and the deer used to come out of there and out of here and feed on that grass, and they would dig in the snow even, and when the snow wasn't too deep, to eat all that lush grass out here under these sugar maples here. Well, anyway, it was also a place where a certain big buck liked to live, to bed. He didn't live there his whole life, but he liked to bed there. And during the summer months, you know, May through September, 1st September, that's where he would be when he was growing antlers, kind of all the way out in the middle of this huge elder swamp, great big one south, well, east of there, and huge swamp, and always full of water, a pool of water. And I used to go across to get to this point every now and then to hunt this spot. And but it was always a spot where you would find older, and one, or maybe more, but always had at least one older buck that was a non-breeding buck. Well, breeding was in progress on that island. And many years ago, one of my granddads started hunting deer here in 1902, a long time. And logging had been going on in this country all those years. We started hunting there in 1960. And so, you know, 60 years before, loggers made a road across the swamp here. They probably hauled in a dump truck gravel and raised it up so maybe that road area was maybe a foot and a half higher than the swamp on both sides. And it curved out and went into out to this island, and they logged that. Probably a lot of big trees on it. They didn't want to waste those. Anyway, so there was this road. Now, those deer every now and then, I remember this stand site we put there, I built that thing for my father. It was a permanent stand. It was legal back in those days. But the way my dad operated, it was pretty hard. He just wasn't seeing deer at all there. And finally one day I went out there and decided I'll give it a try, and I shot one of my biggest bucks from that stand, and it was coming along this edge here. And stopped in some heavy evergreens just on this side of it. And I won't go in the story there, but it was a pretty good spot. And my son Dave taken a couple of yearlings here, but what was going on here, while breeding was gone, there was does pulling up out there on that island. And big buck could go out there and chase those yearlings out of there. And that one year, she must have had two yearling bucks, because Dave got one day, and a few days later got another one from the same spot. And that was the end of that. Didn't see any more yearling bucks there. So anyway, that big buck was helping them get yearling bucks over here. We had a spot over here, one of our earlier permanent stands. My kids used to call it the tower stand, because it was kind of on the edge of the hill and kind of a huge elm tree growing on, a great big one. And we built it along the edge there, and there was kind of a little high spot there, a small hill, and that tree was on the hill. And so when you were up there, it looked much higher because the ground out in front was much lower down here. So they called it the tower stand because it seemed so high. But we never, I don't think we ever got a buck from that particular stand. But yeah, that's right, Ken got one from that. Well, yeah, when early during the years that we hunted here, we found this trail going out there. It was all grown up around it, kind of narrow, and evergreens kind of squeezing in and branches interlacing, and you would hardly notice it. And we hardly saw many tracks on there. And when it got to the point where I had discovered, and this is where the discovery was made, where you could identify deer by the length of their tracks, and said, holy cow, a big buck has been going in and out of there. So I went out there one day, and all around this island there was water. All water and elders. Oh, just thick elders all around. And kind of mixed timber here a little bit, but it was still a lot of elders and water on both sides here. So I figured, well, you know, because it had the water around it and this one trail going in there, started calling it a castle. It was kind of like an old medieval castle with a moat around it and one trail, road going in and a gate there, you know, to keep people out, that kind of thing. So we referred to it as the castle. And there was a big dominant buck up there. One year we found that liked to be up there, and he stayed there during the summer when I was growing his antlers. Big 10-pointer. The last time we hunted that buck, I came in across this elder swamp a long way. It was, more than a half mile in the dark. Compass. Now this was straight north that I was going to get there from over there. So I had to keep track of my compass. You don't be wandering around out in this swamp or out in that swamp. You wanted to really be careful about direction there and to come out there and sit there. And that year I came out, and we've talked about this before, but I won't talk about it a lot now, but I came out there and there was this little string, natural little thing that stuck out into the swamp, and when I got to that point, there were big trees on it, you know, and there's big trees, you could see them against the starlit sky, and I made it get onto that thing, and a nice dry thing, there was a deer trail on there. But no tracks that morning, there's snow on the ground, and I finally got up to where there was a log laying on the ground here, about that tall. And I sat down. I didn't have stools back in those days. And sat down the log, and where I could keep an eye on this edge, and start getting light, you know, and I could see there was a good deer trail around the edge here, going around the margin of that thing, and there was antler rubs on it, and there were scrapes too, but I couldn't see scrapes from where I sat. But I sat there, about 20 minutes, and didn't see anything moving or anything. And I decided I'm going to get a little closer to this trail. You know, I could just see it over there, and it was near through a narrow spot there. A lot of trees, you know, it was filled with mixed timber. And so I'm going to move up. So I stood up. And right over here, not 30 yards away, the area just erupted with deer. I mean, there was, I figured there was a dozen, maybe 11 deer there. The tails were going every which way, going out this way, going in that direction. And holy cow, and I got my rifle up and I was looking around in there, and there was big antlers. Really went just a glimpse. And I was trying to find it after that, and I never saw it. Well, later on, when I went back there, kind of looked around, turned out that well, all those tracks, except that one set made by this big 10-pointer, were 3 inches or shorter. So it was a bunch of does with their young out there, yearlings, and not yearling bucks, but yearling does, and yearling does breed. And apparently what happened with us hunting here, the big buck went out there and he went to this spot. Now, this green spot was a stand of white cedar trees. And there were, being it was a swamp country, there were a lot of white cedar trees as opposed to red cedar trees, like out west and out in the east coast. These are white cedars. And they get to be big, tall trees, bushy on top. You see a lot of them in Minnesota around all the lakes we have up north, cedar trees. And during the winter, whitetails can subsist on the greenery of white cedar trees. There's enough nutrition in them to keep deer alive in the worst conditions in the winter, like right now. Now, that worked out pretty good for deer. Lots of good food around the lakes. All the lakes we have, those more than 10,000 of them. And it also worked good for wolves now and then. If you had a winter that you had, the lake was frozen over, solid, maybe 3-4 inches of ice on it already, but no snow. Wolves love to chase the deer out onto the ice. And a deer running on ice is going to fall down. And because when they're on hoofs, and hoofs don't give them any traction at all. And once a deer, whitetail goes down on the ice, he's going to have an awful time getting back on his feet. The legs keeps slipping out from under him, and the wolves would pounce on him and kill him there. And I know a guy who lived over here, right? Well, one of the lakes up there where this was happening, and it just made him sick in the wintertime to see wolves killing those deer out on the ice like that. So, a pretty common thing. But anyway, the buck, when I went back out there, I found a cluster of antler, big ones, on smaller trees in this clump of cedars here. This area was one of those areas that's half to maybe an acre in size. Kind of round, just like that, moss, but hardly any water in there, but sure a lot of water around it. Just this whole thing around is all water. And there was, along the edge here on this side, there was all kinds of red osiers, which whitetails love to eat in the wintertime, and of course the cedars themselves. And so what had happened is, that buck, because we were hunting this country, was using that as a hideaway. And we found out after that other deer, younger non-breeding bucks in following years, also went there because it was a neat hideaway. And boy, what an escape area around it. If anything, it comes toward them like I did. Gee, they let me walk up and sit on that log while they're laying around out there, and I never noticed because I was busy watching in this direction. And they're safe there. Nothing bothers them there. Nothing comes at them from any direction around there except maybe over here and coming over this way. And they probably watch that way to make sure. But under normal circumstances, any deer that stays there, if a wolf did come along or a bear, They can go right out in that swamp and outdistance a wolf or a bear and real fast anytime anyway. So this was one of those special hideaways. So these clumps of cedars in that country had provided excellent umbrella. You know, they're all together. And during the daytime, you get in there under those cedars, it's almost dark in there. Any time of the day. It's dark under there. There's so much greenery up above, and the trees are all close together, and so those are excellent refuges during severe weather. So it's a refuge from hunters, it's a refuge from wolves during the summer months, where they can, when they're growing antlers, you know, they don't want to be running around the woods when they're growing antlers and injure them while they're soft and covered with velvet, because that creates a permanent injury. They don't recover from that. The antlers don't. So they don't want that to happen. So nice place to go. But that's one of the really good hideaways in this area for whitetails, and especially bucks. And it isn't necessarily just one buck. It could be the big dominant breeding buck while hunting is going on, or it could be non-breeding buck while breeding is in progress, and this guy is traveling all over this surrounding square mile. Actually, this is one of the few bucks, that big 10-pointer, one of the few bucks I've ever known in all my years of studying whitetails that had a 2 square mile breeding range. And I don't know if during the summer months he lived in a square mile like all the other bucks, or he, in spring, after returning to this area from a wintering area, and this one would have been closest to one where my brother Bob and I had spent a lot of time feeding deer back in the 60s when we had severe winters. But anyway, this was a spot to have in your hip pocket when hunting bucks in November. I think it takes a special buck to have a larger range. You know, in farm areas where you have just little woodlots and brushy and tree-lined waterways and whatnot, where you don't have a lot of suitable forest-type habitat, a big buck might seem like somebody will see it on his farm over here one day, and 5 miles away see it, somebody else sees the same buck. And it can be a long, skinny thing, but if you stuck it all together, it probably wouldn't be any bigger than 2 square miles, you see. So it doesn't all have to be, you know, one closed-up area. So these farm area bucks kind of, you know, where forest habitat is limited, places to make antler rods are limited. They can be strung out over longer areas. But anyway, I think it's hard for them to do that, you know. Now, you know, whitetails can smell, the bucks can smell a doe and heat a mile away, probably farther even. My dog can do that when it's downwind of a female dog, but they can smell them a mile away. I don't know if they can smell them 2 miles away. But when they're a mile away, you know, and this travels around during the period that does are in heat, it has an easy way to keep track of who's in heat right now in that mile, square mile. And maybe that's harder to do when there's 2 square miles. Even more, if you got 2 square miles, he's got another 3 to 5 mature bucks living on each one of those square miles. So he might be dealing with as many as 10 bucks that he's got to beat up from September until, well, the end of October, to make sure he's at the top of the pecking order, which gives them the right to breed all the does in that 2 square miles. So that's a lot of bucks to beat up and keep away once breeding begins. He's going to run them off range, and to keep to hold on to an area that large has got to be that buck's got to be pretty special. And so not many bucks do that, are able to do that. But when the ones that do are the ones I've known that do that were really big, nice bucks. Now, anyway, that buck didn't get away. Later that day, way down here, there's a logging trail coming down here. across that logging trail out in the woods, my oldest daughter Peggy was waiting. My boys and I were surrounding this area in the morning. All these stands were filled with people, one way over here. But we didn't get it, and after I saw them all dash out into this elder swamp going this direction, I came out and gathered everybody together early that morning. We went out to the road, and while we were on our way to the road, we heard a shot. And it was down here. And we were all wondering, geez, Peggy must have got a deer. As far as we know, she was the only one over there. And we got to the road, and here she comes to the road. She's coming our way, smiling. And she said, wait, do you see the buck? It was the castle buck. That deer had gone around and headed back, but huge, that 20-mile-long spruce bog was down here. That's where he was going. It's not safe here anymore, so he was going to go down there and stay there. And he was alone, you know. All you girls will have to come out to where I am. You know, they can smell a buck. At that time, they just loaded with musk smell, and they can smell them a mile away too. But I'm getting out of here, so he did. But he went by about 30 yards from where she was standing in a permanent tree stand I had made for her down there, and she got it. And you see a picture of it here right now. Here he is. Now, here's another picture I want to show you. You know, a lot of times when I'm starting to, you know, I'm getting serious, I got to look for some more areas that bucks use as temporary hideaways. And they are not simple things. They don't just go over there and lay down and then run to another spot when some hunter comes close. These older bucks, they don't want to be bothered with that. So they'll go off ranch. They know the story. They've been through this before. So I was looking for other places, but right here and right here, no, there wasn't one there and then there, but those two places for sure. There was always a trail, little used, going right through the alders out into the swamp, you know, like right here. You'll see a picture of that, of this trail going into an alder swamp, right here. Now, when you go out into the, you know, they started using this more and more once they got used to somebody being here. My dad was making it easy for them to figure that out. So they don't want to use this road to go in and out of there anymore. They would go through this way on that trail. And one day I said, I'm going to walk on that trail. And it's from here to there. And what a mess it was. I mean, this is elder swamp water, puddles of water all over the place, and these interlacing elders. And in the middle of it, there was a whole bunch of big trees that have gone down. They were old trees, great big popples, probably 2 feet in diameter at the base, you know, mature popples. Finally just rotted, I suppose, and fell down, but there was a slug of them right here. And, was that something to climb through there. I mean, they didn't worry much about being followed by a human there. I was probably the only one who ever did it on that trail, because this was really a tough thing to do. It didn't matter to them to say, we're not going this way. They started using this trail a lot to go in and out of that castle. So, and this one the same way. This had more cover on both sides than that one. That was, but anyway, that's one kind. Now, we're going to go now to another kind of a place I found. I have several examples here before we're done. Now, here's something to keep in mind. You know, us Nordbergs, we don't, I used to hunt bedding areas of older bucks a lot, back in the 60s and 70s, and I was fairly successful. I got quite a few dominant breeding bucks by doing that. And especially, right after breeding was over. I got to that point because I knew that those big bucks would go to that site right after the breeding because they are really wore out deer by the time, and they need 2 weeks of rest before the next breeding phase begins again. But anyway, so we leave those alone. And the reason is, if you go there and you alarm that buck in his bedding area during the hunting season, he's gone for the rest of the season. More than likely he'll abandon his whole breeding range or home range, and he won't be back until hunting is over, and that's just a fact of life. When you jump a deer or alarm a deer in his bedding area, you have ruined the safest place he knows. It's like you at home. If somebody breaks into your home, you know, in the night or something, or burglarizes it, all of a sudden you don't feel very safe in your own home. And the same way with the buck. This is it. This is his safest place he knows. So we try to stay away from them. Now think of that. Bucks grow antlers. You know, during the summer months, they use these hideaways to avoid having to escape from something hurriedly. You know, run through the woods and perhaps injure their antlers while they're still soft and covered with velvet. And I know it. I don't know if they're thinking that, but it seems that's what's happening. They just want to be hidden and not bothered. And then they get real active as soon as they shed velvet. It's like being let out of jail, and they're exploring, they're traveling all over their breeding ranges or home ranges and visiting all the other deer they haven't seen all summer and that kind of thing. And feeding with other bucks and fighting with them. All those things start happening after September 1st. But meanwhile, they don't want to be bothered. So, if you're going to scout for places like that, it wouldn't be a good idea to do it during the antler growing season, you know, from mid-May until September 1st. Stay out of there. Because bucks are growing antlers from the last half of May until September 1st, and they're in their hideaways during that period, that's more than likely, you know. In farm areas, they might be out a lot because they've learned, you know, they've learned to live with people, the farmer and the dog that lives over there and all this kind of thing. It's different there, but in northern forest areas, or any forest areas, this is going to be pretty much true. You don't want to goof up a bedding area of a buck, a big dominant buck, or a hideaway. They're hard to tell the difference when you find them, of a non-breeding buck when breeding is going on. But you don't want to goof them up before you even have a chance to take advantage of that knowledge. So I don't scout for bedding areas or for almost anything during the summer months. You know, when all the mosquitoes and deer flies and ticks and everything are really active out there in the woods. My favorite time to scout for, many decades now has been early spring, right after snow melt. And here in Minnesota, that's, you know, late April normally, and maybe the first week in May. Good time to scout. And I love to scout then because there's no leaves on the trees yet, and but all the trails and antler rubs and grouse grapes that deer use during the hunting season are really easy to see with no leaves on the trees. You know, you can see that they're so obvious. Boy, that was a well-used trail. All winter it's been under snow, and now snow's all gone. And opened it up, and those antler rubs, they looked just like they were made a week ago. And the ground scrapes, wherever you find them, oh yeah, there's a nice big ground scrape there. That kind of information is most obvious in spring and easiest to see way over there. And when you're looking for a bedding area, that can be, that's usually the first thing when I see one, I'm thinking bedding area right away. I see, oh, there's an antler rub over there, and it's off trail. We should go over there and look at that. Look around for more antler rubs. Because in the old days, well, there's still, okay, you'll see some pictures here in this series, like right now, of bedding areas of big bucks just loaded with antler rubs all over the place in there. So they're easy to spot that time of the year. So that's a good time. You aren't going to be changing anything the buck is going to be doing during the hunting seasons later in the fall. So good time to scout for bedding areas of bucks. And easier to find them then because you can see antler lumps way over there. And that's, and one or, well, clusters, usually 6 or more, are the first thing, the number one sign of a buck bedding area. So anyway, keep that in mind. Hey guys, here's another example of a buck bedroom or a buck hideaway during a period of time when does are in heat in November. Up where we hunt, there's a clear cut. It's got to be kind of old now, but it was cut after we started hunting in this region, and it's a huge clear cut, and it's kind of a different one. Well, in some ways it's typical, but in this one area here, up in this corner of it, there's a lot of deep grass. That grass 6 feet deep there, and I don't know. One of my sons calls it canary grass, and it might be canary grass, but there's a lot of grass. That's not the only kind of grass, but it's a popular feeding area for whitetails in this area during summer months, you know, all the way from when they return from their wintering area until the end of the first week in November. A lot of good grass in this area here. Most of this other area is just full of slashings, you know, branches and stumps, and it's a terrible place to walk in this area. And down in this area. Well, this isn't too bad. It's kind of grassy in there too. But some years ago, I had a ground level stand site right here, at this point. And the idea was to shoot a deer on this little island here. And this little island, you could go out there anytime, every year you could go out there and check it. And you would find lots of big beds, 50 inches or longer in there. You know, one buck making all these beds. And 4-inch tracks and 1-inch droppings. And boy, you know, we just paid a lot of attention to that island because of it. Because it was a popular hideaway. It's out in the open. It's open all around it. And you think, oh, you wouldn't think this was a hideaway, but it was. And part of the reason is because when you're in this little island, see, this was for some reason or another, they didn't cut the trees down in this little area right here, all around it. And so it was all mature trees in there. And brush. There are a lot of hazels in there, and they're this tall and thick. But anyway, there's grasses in there under these big trees, big pines there, white pines. And so my son Dave one year decided he was going to put a stand and a tree on in that island, and I wasn't too happy about that because you're going to go out there across this opening in the dark in the morning, and they're feeding here. That's going to screw it up. I didn't think that was a good idea. But somehow it worked. He was going to put his son Tyler in a tree stand there. And so that's what he did. It was on the island. Well, apparently there was a buck there making tracks and droppings and beds like that on that little island there. And now this brown stuff all around this, all elder brush. And up here, this blue wavy line is a stream. that runs through the area up there. And here, that's kind of typical here, this bedding area, buck bedding area or buck hideaway while does are underneath, was close to water, like they usually are, close to water, and heck of a escape area. If anybody comes at him, you know, he could look in all directions, see anything coming from this side, you know, during daylight hours or nighttime hours for that matter. What a good place to bed. It's safe. And if he did have to get out of there, he could get into these dense spruces, cross the stream, the dense spruces on the other side of it. Elders all the way between the island and this area here. This dotted line is a deer trail that goes off in that direction. But real safe place. But I've seen places. I know when I was in the Navy, and I think I talked about it once about being bow hunting with a bunch of guys on a naval weapons station near Richmond, Virginia. And we were sitting in trees, and there just a little plank of wood in a crotch of a tree, and you get up there maybe 6 feet, not much higher than that, and pretty primitive. And spikes pounded into the trunk, and you climb up there. But anyway, I remember one day when I was sitting there, we sat there all morning, there was about 6 of us went there together to hunt deer on this. And this weapon station had a big fence around, so these were fenced in deer, but it was about a 40-acre area. And there was more deer than there should be for that small of a space. And sitting there, and just before noon, I saw this big buck come along the edge of timber over on my left in an open field. It was grass, clover and alfalfa out there, but it was open, and he came along the edge of there, and just like this, there was a little spot covered with brush and trees, just really thick in there. And he went into it, and he didn't come out. And it was a nice buck, big rack. And pretty soon, here comes a couple of these guys that were out there walking across that opening toward me. And they were cutting over to where I was, and they walked right by that bunch of brush, you know, that little island out in that opening. And I got up close, and one of them was a good friend of mine, and I told Pete, you know, you guys just walked past a great big buck. And he's in that little patch of timber you see over there on the edge there. On one side, he's in there. He never came out of there. I saw him go in there. And we went right by, there was no deer there. I said, well, bucks are so good at this. He's laying down in there. He watched you go by. You know, he could have run off into the woods if he had to, but he watched you go by. I couldn't see him, but I know he's there. I said, why don't you go back there and get over on this side and walk in there. And so he well, okay, he said, I'll go there. And everybody else was really interested in this. We were all standing around there. So he goes over there. It was about maybe 100 yards away from where we were. No, not even that, 80 yards. Well, he goes up to the brush pile, and he's looking in there, and he can't see. He looks back. I said, he's in there. You know, I didn't say it, but I was pointing. Then he went around the backside, and he looks back again, and he's shaking his head like this. I said, I put him go in there. So finally he walked in there, and then almost immediately out came the buck on the other side, went running across the opening, and then a lot of timber over in this direction. And before he got to that, there was all kinds of arrows going through the air, clicking through branches and everything. At the buck, nobody even came close to hitting him, and he disappeared. Everybody stood there with their mouths hanging up, and they couldn't believe that. You know? But that's so typical. Out west, a buck will maybe find a little spot like that and use that for a hideaway, because it just seems like nobody would suspect there's anything in that little patch of timber there, or maybe just a patch of tall grasses out in the middle of nowhere. But wide open spaces gives a buck a chance to see anything coming toward him over a great distance from that spot. And he can leave there long before any hunter that's coming toward him gets to be within a dangerous range. Even when I was hunting up in Hungarian partridge in Saskatchewan one year, my brother and I used to go up to Kindersley and hunt geese every fall. And we were on the way back and we stopped this ranch. We had talked to that rancher before about hunting there. And he said he had a lot of hunts there. He said, you guys should come in and hunt those sometime. And they have these long windbreaks between these big fields, you know, and trees of some kind. And so the huns are all kind of usually hanging along the edge of those trees. So just one guy on one side, one guy on the other side, just walk slowly down there and you'll get lots of shooting. Well, we did. Boy, were they tough to hit. Come out of there squawking and fly like a mile away before they would land. But I remember coming up to a thing like that. It was covered with plum trees, wild plums, with thorns on them, you know, kind of thorny thing. And I was looking at that, you know, and this kind of thick grass is growing down below there, and looking in there. I wonder if there's any huns in there. And I said, I'm going to stoop down and walk through that thing. And about halfway through there, geez, one of the biggest bucks I ever saw. He was as wide as a steer and a great big rock. He come bounding out of the other side and took off and then crossed that tree line further down and disappeared. But typical, you know, it can be smart. I know buck, you know, one of our clear cuts, there was a patch of grass out in the middle of it, not more than 3 foot deep, and it was clear all around it. It's a patch of grass about maybe 30 feet long and maybe 5 feet wide or something, maybe a little lot wider than that. That's all it was. And I remember I was hunting along a stream on one side of it where all the tall timber was yet. And I remember a big bed there. And it was time to head back. Camp was getting late in the day. And I was headed right across that opening. And I got close to that patch of grass. And up jumped the cow, moose, and a calf. They were laying in that patch out in the middle of that opening there. And you couldn't see them, you know. I said, what a smart place to be. Oh, you know, well, if I was a moose hunter, I could have easily taken a moose. But you know, if you're an animal in wolf country and you got a calf and all the wolves in the country can't wait to eat that calf, pretty safe place to be. You know, you can move out long before the wolves are close to them. But they stayed in that grass, probably hoping I'd walk by without knowing they were there. But I'm sure there's a lot of bucks in this world who have laid down in cover no more than that and had hunters walking right by them, people on drives going right by them, that kind of thing. They do that. They get their head down right on the ground and just lay real still while people walk by. Well, anyway, here's a picture of what happened when Tyler, Dave's son, he was young then, was in that tree. You'll see a picture right here. My son John took it. You've seen this one before. His first buck, his big trophy class buck. Here's another picture. I got one about 15 minutes before Tyler. I said, across the road, maybe about 3/4 of a mile away, and we put those 2 big bucks on our wagon that we used to haul deer back to camp on by, you know, pulling on my garden cart they brought from home just for that purpose. So look at these. That's a lot of deer meat. That's about, it's about 600 pounds of deer on that cart. So it was quite a weight there. But look at that nice buck that he got. And this, you know, living in that. And that was typical. And you know, we've taken other deer here in this area. And so, well, one year I got one right there while I was sitting there, right in front of me, 8-pointer. But anyway, don't overlook places like that. they're worth going, you know, we say, oh, there's not going to be anything there. Go on out there and take a look, you know. And you never know what you're going to find, but I found more in one place like that where a big buck that was his hideaway, and it was effective. Before you check off, be sure to subscribe. I wish you would, you guys. I know it's kind of a, you know, now you're busy. You probably spent 15 minutes more than you should have during your lunch hour at work, and so you got to get busy. But first chance you get, be sure to subscribe, and it costs nothing, and you know you'll get a notice that this thing is being shown for the very first time when it's finally is submitted, and that sort of thing. And then also be sure to check the thumbs up. That's just as important, and these are important to my future as a YouTube presenter. So I appreciate you doing those things. Well, with that, guys, take care now. Anyway, with that, again, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you again soon. Be sure to visit my website. Here's the link. Here you'll find links to my blog posts, my Twitter account, my YouTube account, my Amazon store with links to my ebooks, my son's eBay store, a money saver if you're ordering from Canada or other countries, my website bookstore, and much more.